There is a stretch of road in the Blue Ridge foothills that locals still refuse to drive after dark. It runs through a hollow that was once thick with hemlock and laurel, and at the bottom of that hollow for almost 40 years there sat a 2-story inn with a wide porch, a stone chimney, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome Traveller." Between 1863 and 1899, the ledger inside that inn recorded the names of guests who came in from the trail, ate a hot meal, paid for a bed, and were never seen again. Not one. The family who ran it was polite. They were church-going. They were known to every peddler and drover on the mountain road. And when investigators finally walked into that cellar in the spring of 1900, what they found underneath the smokehouse was so far beyond what anyone had prepared for that the county sheriff, a man who had fought at Cold Harbor, sat down on the back steps and wept. This is the story of the Pritchard family, the inn they ran for almost 4 decades, and what was actually happening in the rooms upstairs while the coffee was still warm on the stove. To understand how a family could operate a slaughterhouse disguised as an inn for 36 years without a single arrest, you have to understand what the road looked like. The old Buncombe Turnpike ran from Tennessee down through western North Carolina and into South Carolina, and it was the main artery for drovers pushing hogs, cattle and turkeys south to market. In the years right after the Civil War, that road carried a strange kind of traffic. Confederate veterans walking home with whatever coin they had left, federal pension agents heading into the mountains, peddlers with packs full of tin goods and small quantities of silver, circuit preachers, timber cruisers scouting virgin stands of poplar and chestnut, and in almost every case these men were travelling alone, carrying cash, and telling no one their exact route. Elias Pritchard understood this before anyone else did. He had come back from the war in 1865 with a limp and a wife named Verna, and he had inherited a piece of bottomland from his father that sat exactly 1 day's walk from the last decent stopping point on the northern side of the ridge. He built the inn with his own hands over the winter of 1866 and 1867, using chestnut logs and hand-cut stone from the creek bed. The building had 4 rooms upstairs and a common room downstairs. There was a kitchen off the back, a smokehouse 10 paces from the kitchen door, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the smokehouse. That root cellar is the part you need to remember, because the root cellar was not what it appeared to be. Verna Pritchard bore Elias 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. The eldest, a boy named Absalom, would eventually stand trial alongside his father. The youngest, a girl named Ruth, would be the one who finally walked into the sheriff's office and said the sentence that ended it all. But for now, Verna was simply a young mother running a mountain inn, and the guests who came through the door thought she was one of the sweetest women they had ever met, small, quiet, a good cook. Her cornbread was said to be the finest on the turnpike. The killings almost certainly began in the winter of 1867. The earliest suspicious ledger entry was dated March 11th, 1868, and belonged to a man named Thomas Alderman, a Confederate veteran from Yancey County who was walking home carrying, according to a letter he had mailed to his sister 2 weeks earlier, roughly $42 in silver. Alderman never made it home. No investigation was ever opened, and the pattern that would define the next 32 years was set. A man travelling alone, carrying money, known to have entered the Pritchard Inn, never seen leaving. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Pritchard Inn case file, the guest ledger entries with the annotated markings, the coroner's inventory from the cellar excavation, the full written testimony of the surviving daughter given under oath in the county courthouse. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The method the Pritchards used was almost mundane in its efficiency. When a traveller arrived at the inn, Elias or one of the older boys would meet him at the porch and take his horse to the small barn behind the smokehouse. Verna would seat him at the trestle table and bring him a bowl of stew and coffee. The coffee, according to Ruth's later testimony, was the first stage. Verna kept a small tin of powdered belladonna root on the top shelf of the pantry, and she would stir a measured amount into the pot before pouring. The dose was calculated to induce heavy drowsiness within about 20 minutes, not death. Death came upstairs in the second bedroom on the left, which had been fitted with a hinged section of floorboards directly above the smokehouse. The guest would be shown to that room. Verna would even turn down the quilt for him. She would ask if he wanted a candle left burning. She would say good night in the same soft voice she used with her own children. And within an hour of the door closing, the man on the bed would be so deeply unconscious that he would not stir even when the floorboards beneath him were quietly unlatched and folded back on their iron hinges. Elias and Absalom would come up the back stairs carrying a canvas sling. They would roll the guest onto it, tie the corners, and lower him through the opening in the floor. The drop was about 8 feet. It ended on the packed dirt floor of the smokehouse, where the killing itself was done with a butcher's knife in a manner Ruth described in court as no different from how her father slaughtered hogs in November. The blood was drained into a shallow trough cut into the dirt. The trough emptied into a pit behind the smokehouse that Elias had told his neighbours was for hog offal, and the neighbours had never once questioned why so much of it accumulated in a household that only slaughtered 3 or 4 hogs a year. The body was then dragged the short distance to the root cellar, which was not a root cellar at all, but a burial chamber that Elias had been quietly extending, foot by foot, into the hillside for more than 3 decades. He worked on it in the winter months when the ground was easier to break and no one visited the inn. By the time the family was arrested, the chamber was longer than the inn itself. It ran back into the hill until it hit bedrock, and then it turned and ran parallel to the ridge for another 30 feet. Elias kept the entrance disguised by a false wall of stacked jars, most of which were empty, and behind the jars was a low wooden door that could only be opened by lifting a hidden latch on the inside of the frame. By the time investigators excavated that chamber in the summer of 1900, it was 58 feet long, roughly 7 feet wide, and lined on both sides with stacked human remains separated by layers of quicklime and red mountain clay. The final count, based on skulls alone because many of the smaller bones had disintegrated in the acidic soil, was 142. 142 travellers who had eaten Verna's cornbread and drunk her coffee and lain down in that upstairs bedroom and never come home. But the count itself is not the darkest part of the Pritchard case. The darkest part is what the family did with what the guests left behind. Every man who entered the inn was carrying something. Silver coins, a pocket watch, a pipe, a folded letter from a wife, a pension voucher, a small quantity of gold dust wrapped in oilcloth. The Pritchards kept everything, not to sell, to store. Investigators found in a locked wooden chest under the floorboards of the master bedroom one of the strangest collections of personal effects ever recovered from a crime scene in 19th century America. 211 pocket watches, each engraved with a different name, 94 wedding rings, 63 folding knives, bundles of letters, some still sealed, taken from the pockets of men whose families had spent decades wondering what had happened to them. And underneath all of it, wrapped in a burlap sack, roughly 9 pounds of loose silver coins dating from as far back as 1841. The chest itself was not hidden well. It was under a rug in the room where Elias and Verna slept, which means that for more than 30 years they went to bed each night on top of the evidence of every murder they had ever committed, and they slept fine. Ruth would later testify that her mother sometimes opened the chest in the evenings and sorted through the watches and rings the way another woman might sort through a sewing basket. She would hold each item up to the lamp, she would read the engravings, and then she would put it back and close the lid and go to bed. There was one item in the chest that the coroner recorded separately from the rest, in a small notation at the bottom of his inventory sheet. It was a child's christening spoon, silver, engraved with the name Ellis, and dated 1872. No one in the Pritchard family was named Ellis. No traveller in the ledger was named Ellis. The spoon has never been matched to any known victim, and it sits today in a state archive in Raleigh with a card next to it that simply says, "Origin unknown." What that spoon was doing in the chest, and how a christening spoon belonging to an infant ended up in the possession of a family that killed grown men for their pocket change, is a question the Pritchard case has never been able to answer. Before we move on to how the family was finally stopped, stop for a second. What you just heard about the chest under the floorboards is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full coroner's inventory. The christening spoon, the engraved names, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The end of the Pritchard family came not through any investigation, but through the youngest daughter's conscience. In the winter of 1899, a traveller arrived at the inn who was different from the others. His name was Henry Sutter. He was a Methodist circuit rider from Ohio, and he had been sent into the mountains to establish contact with isolated congregations along the turnpike. He was 31 years old. He carried almost no money, only a leather satchel of pamphlets, and a small Bible that his mother had given him when he was ordained. He arrived at the inn on the evening of December 22nd, 1899, in a heavy snowstorm, and Verna served him stew and coffee at the trestle table. Ruth was 18 years old that winter. She had been aware for years of what happened in the upstairs bedroom, though her parents had never spoken of it to her directly. She had grown up with the knowledge the way other children grow up with the knowledge of where the well is. It was simply a fact of the household. Her older brothers had been drawn into the work by the time they were 14. Ruth had been kept to the kitchen, kept to the sewing, kept to the visible parts of running an inn. But the walls of a mountain house are thin, and Ruth had lain awake at night from the age of 9 listening to the sound of the back stairs. Something about Henry Sutter broke through. Ruth would later say, on the witness stand, that it was the way he thanked her mother for the coffee. He looked directly at Verna and said the words, "God bless you, ma'am." And Verna smiled back at him and said the words, "God bless you too." And Ruth watched this exchange from the doorway of the kitchen and felt something inside her chest crack open. She said, and this is a direct quote from the trial transcript, that in that moment she understood for the first time that her mother was not a person who did a terrible thing. Her mother was a person for whom the terrible thing had become invisible, and Ruth realized that if she did not act that night, she would eventually become the same kind of person. That night, after her parents had gone to bed and Henry Sutter was lying drugged, in the second bedroom on the left, Ruth climbed the back stairs with a lantern and shook him awake. She told him what was about to happen. She helped him down the back stairs and out through the barn. She saddled her own horse for him because it was the fastest one in the family. She gave him the pocket watch from the chest, the one engraved with the name Thomas Alderman, which she had lifted from her mother's chest 3 days earlier and hidden in the flour bin. She told him to ride north until he reached Marshall, and to go directly to the sheriff and to say the name Pritchard, and not to stop for anyone. Henry Sutter, still half drugged, rode through the snow for 11 hours and arrived at the sheriff's office in Marshall shortly after dawn. The sheriff, a man named Robert Candler, did not believe him at first. He thought Sutter was either drunk or feverish, but Sutter had brought with him that pocket watch, and Candler, who had grown up in Yancey County, recognized the name Thomas Alderman immediately, because Alderman had been the older brother of a boy he had gone to school with, a boy whose family had spent 32 years not knowing what had happened to their son. Candler turned the watch over in his hand for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the snow that was still falling on the town square, and said to his deputy the words that appear in his own official report of that morning. "Get every man you can find. We are going to that inn today." Candler assembled a posse of 14 men and rode for the inn on the morning of December 24th, 1899. They arrived at midday. Elias Pritchard met them on the porch with a rifle. He was 63 years old. He fired one shot, which struck a deputy named Miller in the shoulder, and then he was shot dead on his own front steps by 3 simultaneous rounds from the posse. Verna was found in the kitchen. She did not resist. She was, according to the arresting deputy's report, in the middle of kneading dough for the next morning's biscuits, and she asked if she could finish the batch before they took her because it would be a shame to waste the flour. The deputy told her no. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to the wagon without another word. Absalom, the eldest son, tried to flee through the barn and was captured within the hour. The 3 younger sons were arrested in their beds. Ruth was found sitting on the back porch, waiting, with a small cloth bundle at her feet containing her mother's Bible and a change of clothes. When Candler approached her, she looked up at him and said only one sentence, which he recorded verbatim in his report. She said, "I am the one who sent him." The excavation of the cellar took 6 months. Word of the dig spread through western North Carolina and into Tennessee and Virginia, and by February families were arriving at the site with old letters and old photographs, trying to match a father or brother or son to something in the recovered chest. In 87 cases, they succeeded. In 55 cases, they did not. Those 55 victims were never identified and remain to this day listed in state records only by the numbers assigned to their skulls. The trial took 3 weeks. Verna Pritchard and Absalom Pritchard were both convicted of first-degree murder and hanged in the yard of the county jail on August 14, 1900. The 3 younger sons, who were 19, 22, and 25 at the time of the arrests, were sentenced to life in prison and died there, the last of them in 1947. Ruth was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony and moved to Ohio, where she lived under a different name until her death in 1954 at the age of 73. She never married. She never had children. She worked for most of her adult life as a cook in a Methodist boarding house, and the people who knew her there said she was one of the quietest women they had ever met. The inn itself was burned to the ground in the autumn of 1900 by order of the county commissioners. The root cellar was collapsed and filled with quicklime. The bodies of all 142 victims were reinterred in a mass grave in a Baptist churchyard 6 miles from the inn site, and a stone was placed over them that read simply, "Travellers." The unclaimed pocket watches and rings and letters sat in a locked cabinet in the Marshall Courthouse for 70 years, and were eventually transferred to a state archive where they remain today, still bearing the engraved names of men whose stories ended in an upstairs bedroom while the coffee was still warm on the stove. There is a question that historians have asked about the Pritchard case for more than 100 years, and it is the question that makes this story genuinely unbearable. How is it possible that a family killed 142 people over 36 years in a building that sat directly on a major road, and no one, not a sheriff or judge or neighbor or preacher, ever suspected anything? The answer is not that the Pritchards were geniuses. Their method was crude. Their record-keeping was careless. The chest under the floor was hidden by nothing more than a rug. The answer is that the men they killed were, almost without exception, the kind of men that 19th century America had already decided not to look for: veterans without families, peddlers with no fixed address, circuit preachers between congregations, widowers walking to see distant children, men whose disappearance registered, if they registered at all, as small notices in county newspapers that no one read. The Pritchards understood something about their own country that is worth understanding today. They understood that a person can vanish in plain sight if no one has been assigned to notice him, and they built an entire family enterprise on that understanding, and they operated it successfully for almost 4 decades, and they were only stopped because an 18-year-old girl looked at her mother saying, "God bless you," to a stranger, and felt something break inside her that could not be put back. The hollow where the inn once stood is still there. The foundation stones are still visible if you know where to look, half sunk into the loam and covered in moss and hemlock needles. The Baptist churchyard, where the travellers are buried, is a mile off the current highway, and the stone that marks the grave is small and worn now, the word carved into it barely readable. But it is still there. And if you stand in front of it long enough, you can almost hear the sound of 142 men on 142 nights thanking a small quiet woman for a cup of coffee they did not know was the last thing they would ever taste. That is the true story of what was buried underneath the Pritchard smokehouse. And that is what the sheriff was looking at when he sat down on the back steps in the spring of 1900 and wept.